The bill was soft at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. Caleb turned it over in his fingers, smoothing it against his thigh, like it might somehow multiply if he treated it gently enough. A $20 bill. One. That was everything he had left in the world on a Wednesday morning in early October, standing beside his truck in the gravel lot of filling station outside Millhaven, Tennessee. The truck itself was a problem. The left rear tire had gone soft overnight, not flat enough to be obvious, but soft enough that he felt the pull on the highway and had to stop. He'd been driving since 4 in the morning. Coming from Knoxville where the construction job had dried up without warning. The foreman had handed him a check on Friday and told him not to come back Monday. No explanation, no argument, just a check and a turn back. Caleb was 19 years old, and he was trying very hard not to feel like his life was already going wrong. He sat on the tailgate and counted the 20 again, as if the act of counting might change the number. It did not. He hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon when he bought a gas station sandwich that tasted like the plastic it came wrapped in. His stomach had moved past grumbling into a kind of dull silence, which he'd heard someone once say was worse. That silence meant the body had stopped expecting anything. He had no plan beyond driving to his uncle's place in Crossfield, about 40 miles south. His uncle hadn't exactly invited him. Caleb had called from a payphone the night before, and his uncle had said, "You can sleep in a barn if you need to," which was not the same as welcome, but was not the same as no either. He figured he could make the 40 miles on fumes and willpower if he didn't stop again. But the tire needed air. He pushed off the tailgate and walked toward the small general store attached to the filling station. It was a kind of place that still existed in pockets of rural Tennessee, slightly out of time, with a hand-painted sign over the door and a wooden porch that creaked under every step. A tin thermometer on the wall read 54 degrees. The air smelled like cut wood and diesel, and the particular coldness of a morning that hadn't decided to warm up yet. Inside, a ceiling fan turned slowly despite the October chill, and a radio on the shelf played something country that Caleb didn't recognize. The woman behind the counter was middle-aged with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, watching the door like she'd been watching it all morning. 2 other people were in the store, a young man in a camouflage jacket buying cigarettes, an old man at the counter ahead of him, placing items down one by one with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about each purchase before making it. Caleb picked up a bottle of water and stood near the back, watching the tire pressure gauge on the pegboard and calculating whether he needed it or could just ask the woman to borrow hers. He wasn't paying much attention to the old man at the counter until he heard the tone change. "That's $31.40, the woman said. The old man reached into the front pocket of his work pants and placed a small fold of bills on the counter. He smoothed it with 2 fingers the same way Caleb had smoothed his 20 outside. Then he looked at the total on the register screen for a moment without expression. "I've got 26, he said. His voice was even, not embarrassed, not pleading, just stating a fact, the way a man might read the temperature off a gauge. The woman's expression shifted, not cruel, but not warm either. "I can hold the account if you want to leave some of it," she said, meaning she would take what he had and log the rest as store credit or debt, depending on how you looked at it. Her voice had a particular flatness of someone who had done this before and did not enjoy it. The young man in camouflage had turned slightly, watching without trying to look like he was watching. The old man looked at his items on the counter. A bag of dried beans, a small tin of coffee, a box of salt, a coil of wire that Caleb would later understand was fence repair wire. Basic things. The kind of things a man bought because he needed them, not because he wanted them. "I'll leave the coffee," the old man said. He reached forward and slid the tin to the side of the counter. His hands were large and weathered, the kind of hands that belonged to someone who had worked outside for decades without apology. He was not a tall man, but there was something steady about him, something that didn't shift even when the situation asked him to make himself smaller. Caleb felt something move in his chest. He couldn't have named it exactly. It wasn't pity. The old man didn't look like he wanted pity. It was something closer to recognition, the way you sometimes see a version of a feeling you know while playing out in someone else's body. He stood there for a moment with the water bottle in his hand and the 20 in his pocket. He thought about the 40 miles to Crossfield. He thought about the tire. He thought about the gas gauge, which had been sitting on a quarter tank that he'd been promising himself was enough. He thought about his uncle's barn and the fact that he hadn't eaten since yesterday, and that the $20 was the difference between arriving at his uncle's place with options and arriving with nothing. He thought about all of that. Then he walked to the counter. "Here," he said. He put the 20 down beside the old man's bills without making a production of it. He looked at the woman behind the counter, not at the old man. That should cover it. There was a brief silence, the kind that happens when something small but unexpected occurs in a small space. The old man turned and looked at Caleb, not quickly, not with surprise exactly, but with the full attention of someone who had decided to look. His eyes were pale gray and clear, and he didn't look away the way most people would when a stranger does something unexpectedly decent. "I appreciate that," the old man said. "No excess, no performance." "It's fine," Caleb said, which was not entirely true but was the right thing to say. "What's your name, son?" Caleb Marsh." The old man nodded once, the way you nod when you are filing something away. "Eldon Graft," he said. He picked up his bag from the counter, tucked it under one arm, and walked to the door. He paused just before pushing it open and looked back at Caleb once more. Then he was gone. The woman behind the counter handed Caleb his change, $4.60, and looked at him with an expression that might have been respect or might have been curiosity. He couldn't tell. He bought the water, pocketed the change, and walked outside. The gravel lot was quiet. Eldon Graft truck, an old Ford the color of dried mud, was pulling slowly out onto the road. Caleb watched it go. Then the silence of what he had just done arrived. $4.60. He sat back on his tailgate and opened the water and drank half of it without stopping. The cold of it settled in his empty stomach like a stone. He looked at the remaining bills in his palm. He could not buy air for his tire with this. He could not buy food. He could barely buy a coffee, and that would leave him with nothing at all. He thought about the 40 miles. He thought about what empty meant when it stopped being a metaphor and started being a fact. He thought about 19 years old and a soft tire and a barn he hadn't been invited to. Exactly. He pressed his back teeth together and stared down the road where the old Ford had gone. He had no idea why he'd done it. He told himself it was the right thing. He told himself he would have wanted someone to do the same. He told himself it would work out. But the telling didn't quiet the feeling that had settled in underneath all the telling, the feeling that it just made things significantly worse, and that there was no one to blame for it but himself. The morning did not warm up. He sat on the tailgate for a long time, not ready to get back in the truck and face the distance. The tire went flat 4 miles south of Millhaven, not soft anymore. Flat. The truck pulled hard to the right, and Caleb brought it to the shoulder of the road with the particular patience of someone who has run out of the kind of energy it takes to be upset. He sat in the cab for a moment with the engine off and the October wind pressing against the glass. Then he got out and looked at it. The rubber had given up somewhere between the filling station and a county road sign that read, Crossfield, 36 miles. 36 miles. He had a spare in the bed, which was something. He'd changed the tire in the cold with no gloves, his hands going numb and clumsy around the lug nuts. And when he was done, he sat in the gravel on the shoulder for a moment with his back against the rear quarter panel, catching his breath. His stomach had moved from silence into something that felt like it was folding in on itself. He thought about the sandwich yesterday. He thought about the $4.60. He thought about Eldon Graff driving away in that mud-colored Ford without looking back, carrying a bag with dried beans and salt and fence wire, perfectly calm. Caleb had handed a stranger his last $20, and the stranger had said, "I appreciate that," and walked out. That was it. No name recognition, no story, no reciprocation, just a nod and a departure. Caleb started the truck again and drove. He reached his uncle's place just before noon. The barn was dry, which was something. His uncle was not unkind, but he was a man of narrow hospitality. He showed Caleb what the cots were, told him it was leftover stew in the pot on the stove, and made it clear through the specific silence that follows an explanation that this arrangement had a natural endpoint that would arrive sooner rather than later. Caleb thanked him and ate 2 bowls of the stew standing up at the kitchen counter, and felt, for the first time in 2 days, like a person instead of just a body moving through cold air. He slept hard that night. In the morning, he started making calls about work. There was not much in Crossfield. There was a feed store that wasn't hiring. There was a man 2 roads over who needed fence work done, but only for 3 days. There was talk of a crew going to do harvest work in Kentucky, but it hadn't materialized into anything with a phone number attached yet. Caleb took the fence work and spent 3 days in the cold, driving posts in the ground that had already started to harden toward winter, earning enough to eat on for another week and a half if he was careful. He was careful. On the 4th day, his uncle mentioned, without particular emphasis, that the Graff property up on Route 9 had been looking for seasonal help on and off. Old man Graff, his uncle said, not looking up from his paper, has about 400 acres out there. Keeps to himself. Caleb put his coffee cup down slowly. "Eldon Graff?" he said. His uncle looked up then. "You know him?" "I met him once," Caleb said, briefly. His uncle made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Most people around here have met him briefly. That's about all he offers. Decent man. Fair. Doesn't talk much." He turned a page. "Land's been in his family since before the war. He runs it himself mostly. Had a son who didn't want it." He said that last part without judgment, but it settled in the room like a fact that had some weight to it. Caleb drove out to the Graff property that afternoon. The driveway was a 1/4 mile of gravel flanked by a fence line that was in good repair, better repair than most of what he'd been seeing in the county. The farmhouse was modest, white paint going slightly gray, a porch with 2 chairs on it, and a woodpile stacked with precision against the south wall. There was nothing decorative about the place. Everything was functional and maintained, and the distinction between those 2 things told you something about the man who lived there. Eldon Graff was in the equipment shed. When Caleb pulled up, he came out wiping his hands on a rag. And when he saw Caleb, he stopped for just a moment, then kept walking toward him with the same unhurried steadiness he'd had at the counter in the store. "Caleb Marsh," he said. Caleb was surprised the name had held. "Yes, sir," he said. "I heard you might have work." Eldon looked at him for a moment. "Where are you staying?" "My uncle's place. Rains, off County Road 7. Eldon nodded. "How long you been farming?" "I haven't," Caleb said. "Not formally. I grew up with a garden, some animals. I did construction last 2 years." "Construction teaches you something," Eldon said, not as a compliment exactly, but as an honest assessment. "Come inside." The kitchen was clean and spare. A wood stove in the corner put out steady heat. Eldon set 2 mugs on the table and poured coffee without asking whether Caleb wanted any. They sat down across from each other, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable the way silences with strangers usually are. It was the silence of a man who spoke when he had something to say. "I've got 412 acres, Eldon said. "I farm about 280 of it actively. Rest is timber and creek bottom." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I'm 68 years old. I'm not looking for charity work to give out, and I'm not looking for a farmhand who needs to be told what to do every morning. He paused. I'm looking for someone who can learn the land and eventually take on part of the operation. Caleb kept his expression steady. What does that mean practically? It means you work here for a season, full season, spring through harvest. You earn a wage, fair wage, not generous, because you don't know what you're doing yet, and that has a value attached to it. He was matter-of-fact about this without being harsh. At the end of that season, if the work is what I think it'll be, we talk about a lease arrangement on the South 40. Lease to own over 10 years, structured so the payments come out of what the land produces. He looked at Caleb directly. You'd be farming land that earns its own mortgage. That's how it works if it works. And if it doesn't work? Caleb asked. Then you've had a season of honest work, and you know more than you did. That's not nothing. Caleb looked at his coffee. He thought about the $20. He thought about whether this was connected, whether the old man had seen something in the filling station, and decided to repay it in a roundabout way. He almost asked. Instead, he said, "Why me?" Eldon was quiet for a moment. He turned his mug a quarter turn on the table. I've been watching this place go without a next generation for about 10 years, he said. I've had men out here who wanted the land but not the work. Men who wanted the idea of farming. He looked up. I didn't see that in you. You saw me for about 3 minutes, Caleb said. Sometimes that's enough, Eldon said, not as wisdom, just as a statement of how it had gone. Caleb looked out the kitchen window. The fields were brown and cut down to stubble, waiting on winter. The fence lines ran straight to the tree line. The sky was the low gray of late October in Tennessee, pressing down over everything with a kind of permanence. It was not a beautiful scene in any obvious way. It was a working scene, a scene that asked something of you. He thought about Knoxville. He thought about the foreman handing him a check without explanation. He thought about soft tires and gas gauges and barn cots and Stu Eaton standing up. He thought about what he was willing to do and what he was willing to become, and whether those two things were still the same at 19 as they would be at 30. I'd want to understand the lease terms in writing before the season ends, he said. Eldon nodded. That's the right thing to ask. And I want to know what I'm learning, not just what I'm doing. I want to understand why decisions get made. Also right, Eldon said. Caleb looked at him. Then yes. Eldon stood up and put his mug in the sink. He looked out the window at the fields for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has tended for a long time. Then he said, without turning around, You start Monday. Bring work boots with some miles on them. Caleb drove back to his uncle's place in the late afternoon with the low sun cutting orange across the fields on either side of the road. He didn't feel like celebrating. He felt something quieter than that. The particular steadiness that arrives when the ground beneath you stops moving, when the thing you've been reaching for is not a dream but a morning, a specific morning, a Monday, with work boots and cold air and 40 acres waiting on the other side of what you're willing to do. He didn't know yet what kind of farmer he would be, but he had given away his last $20 to a stranger at a store counter, and the stranger had looked at him the way you look at something you intend to remember, and sometimes that is how the rest of the life begins. Not with miracle, not with money falling from the sky, but with man deciding what kind of person he is in the 3 seconds before it costs him something. That was enough to start with.